Welcome to The Space for It with Makayla and Jacob. We are two therapists working to navigate making space for what comes up as part of the human experience. Today, we're talking about why it's so hard to talk about sex and therapy.
So part of what inspired us to talk about this is both of us have read this book called Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski. I should have looked up how to say her name before we started, but I didn't. But we both read this book, and it is about essentially exploring, well, specifically it's about female sexuality, but it's kind of about exploring sexuality from a science-based perspective. And she really digs into a lot of the things that get in the way of being able to do that in a healthy way. And part of what we offer as therapists is that we offer people with a place to talk about these things, the space to talk about it. And we kind of wanted to explore through conversation, like what are some of the things that we see show up in therapy as kind of barriers, but also what are some of the things that she's talked about, and how can we actually make the space for people to talk about things like sex in the context of therapy.
And I think what blocks us from even talking about it outside of therapy. We have the perspective as counselors of what it looks like in a therapy session and how it can be uncomfortable, maybe as the client or the therapist. And these things show up in people's lives outside of therapy too. So a little bit of both, I think.
The more that anything gets talked about, whether it is in therapy or out, because you bring up a very good point, this isn't just about in therapy, the more it gets talked about, the more comfortable we can become with talking about it, which enables us to actually explore it in ways that aren't as inhibited, and in ways where we can actually maybe work through a lot of the shame that ends up being around a topic like sex.
I guess I wonder, to start off, if you have any personal anecdotes about talking about sex and what that's been like for you.
Are we talking in therapy or outside of therapy?
Either one. I think I'd be fascinated to hear both.
One of the benefits that I have found in being a therapist is that you have friends who are therapists. And one of the things that people will often say in therapy, particularly like when they're first starting to work with me or other therapists, I assume this happens too, but you'll be able to tell like, oh, this person wants to say something. And then they'll start saying it with the question, I don't know if this is TMI. Or that's not really a question, but they'll make that statement and then they'll dive into it. And when you're a therapist, I'm pretty sure this is true for pretty much all therapists, there's no such thing as TMI. Like, give me more information. I want to hear it all. This is the space for it. And when you have friends who are therapists, I feel like there's kind of that same vibe where it's like, we can talk about anything. Like, let's go there. Let's explore. And in my personal life, I grew up in a context that was conservative, where we didn't really talk about sex other than kind of negatively. And so I didn't really have a lot of experiences talking about sex in a way that was positive at all until I think after I became a therapist, when I was having conversations with some of my therapist friends that were more about it, and trying to figure out, okay, how do I make space for clients in the therapy space to be able to actually talk about this comfortably. And as I think about it, I think probably the first few conversations that I had a therapist friend in Chicago who she was kind of one of the first people where it's like, oh, okay, let's have conversations about this.
Yeah.
And I think initially it was very weird to have those conversations, because it was like, this feels very different. Like, in a way, it feels almost wrong to talk about, even though it feels like it's a really valuable thing to talk about, because it's bringing this very, very real and very important part of the human experience into a conversation in a way that's meaningful and valuable.
Yeah.
Because if you can't talk about it, then you're left with all of these questions without answers, and that's not really all that helpful.
And it feels pretty lonely.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like too. And I love how you brought up, like, as a counselor, like, generally having this curiosity, being able to go anywhere. And as a new counselor, or as sex being viewed in that way of shame or stigma or wrong kind of to talk about, even as a counselor, when people have that statement of like, I don't know if this is TMI, half my brain is like, there's nothing TMI, and half my brain is like, is there? Like, is it going to be TMI? What do I do with this information when I get it? Like, how do I use that um, to have a productive or helpful perspective or conversation or questions to ask about it? Because it's not something that is really part of our training, or at least it wasn't part of mine, of like how we talk about sexuality. So it's something, that human element in our culture shows up even as counselors.
Because there's so much shame around it, we don't talk about it. Like, personally, I'm I I I'm married, and I've been with my wife either dating or together since a long time ago. I think this year will be our 12th year anniversary of being married, which is crazy. But both of us grew up in this context where there was a lot of shame around sex, where it was this topic where it's like, no, we don't talk about that. It's very hush hush. And that showed up in our relationship. Like, that showed up in lots and lots and lots of tense and complicated conversations and hurt feelings and frustration and tears, because neither of us had the tools to talk about it.
Yeah.
And we both had attitudes around it that were not productive or helpful, and that did not help either. And so that's the other piece to this, is that I know that's not just our experience. I know that's a common experience, and trying to let people know that when that is your experience, you are not alone, and you can talk about it with other people. Like, you can bring it up, and that can actually be really valuable.
Just thinking of memories that have shown up of this over my lifetime, similar. And now that with my partner, it's like 7.5 years. It's like the first relationship being able to talk about this in a way that is actually like helpful or open or connective. And there's still, not a lot of tools necessarily to be able to explore it in those ways. So it's still an ongoing learning process.
There are so many different factors that are at the root of why sex and talking about sex is a topic that's surrounded by so much shame and taboo. And a big part of that is that if you look back in the history of people studying sex, so much of it is rooted in a very male-focused environment. And it's rooted in this idea that, like, there is one way of doing this. There is, like, the penis and vagina sex, and that should culminate in orgasm for everybody involved. And if that's not how it works for you, then you're broken. And if you don't want that, then you're broken. And, like, there are all of these attitudes that essentially say, here it is, like, walk this line. Outside of that, we're going to treat you like you're broken. And one of the things that she talks about in the book is how over the years there have been so many very stigmatizing labels and different treatments that have been produced in order to basically say, if you don't function through this specific lens, that's bad. You need to change. There is something wrong with you.
Yeah.
And that creates so much shame. Like, the idea of shame is that I believe that there's something that is bad or wrong about who I am. And when we feel that just makes us want to hide. Like, shame is the thing that's like, I want to make myself disappear. I don't want to be here anymore.
As you talk about it there, it kind of boils down to the basic concept of, like, different is wrong. And I wonder if going way back, I mean, as humans in smaller societies or things, and I guess this is a question, because not all cultures or societies view sex in the same way that ours does. The Romans had a very different view on sex, a very different culture around it and things. So maybe it isn't an evolutionary thing of, like, different is wrong, or maybe partially is. Like, there's a tendency of the mind to be like, different is uncertain or unknown or scary in that way. And so, I don't know. It's kind of an interesting point there, though, because, like you say, with the male perspective being the one that was more prominent in studying these things, labeling them, talking about them, that seems to be kind of a basis for, in the United States, how we view sexuality as, like, different is wrong.
A lot of it is based in the idea that there should just be one way it works.
Mm.
And there's also all of the dismissiveness and the unwillingness to actually talk about things that are outside of a classically white male environment. There's a really sad reality where, like, if I went to my doctor and I said sex is painful for me, they would very likely take that very seriously and they would want to do something about it. Versus it's a really common experience for a woman to go to the doctor and be like, sex is painful for me, and for the doctor to be like, yep, that is how that works. Mm-hmm. And that's wrong. Like, that's not how it's supposed to work. And we can do something about it. And doing something about it doesn't mean surgery. It doesn't mean pills. It means actually exploring what's going on here and how do we give you what you need in order to be able to function in a way that is healthy or in a way that doesn't involve pain.
So as you talk about that, I wonder about the religious undertone again of like different is wrong. There's one way kind of thinking. I wonder how, because in, again, like say Roman or Greek times, there were many different gods. There were many different right ways, or like not necessarily right and wrong, but it was like there are all of these different things. And as it boiled down to like one, I wonder if that was a big influence partially in this kind of perspective that then was brought over to the US.
We could potentially boil it down to religion, but I think we could also look at it almost through the lens of like sexism, in this idea that one sex is superior to another. And a lot of the more patriarchal undertones within sex, like the study of sex and sexual exploration, do tend to really, really underemphasize, undervalue, under-research anything that's not considered like part of male sexuality. Mm-hmm. And yes, I think, like if I think about Christianity has created a lot of voices that are incredibly unhealthy regarding sex. Like there was the whole purity culture movement that was very much a thing when I was growing up, that heavily focused on virginity. And it's like, your virginity is the thing that you have, and once you lose that, you are much less valuable as a person. Like basically that's your value. Don't lose it.
Yeah.
And that's awful. Like that's such a shaming, stigmatizing, just kind of cruel way to look at someone. And also to say that someone could lose all of their value as a result of a physical activity that they take part in is bizarre. That makes no sense at all.
Yeah, really doesn't.
And I think also, like, this is one of those areas of the topic where we could get into the ridiculous dual standard that exists, where it's like, if let's say I had 1,000 sexual partners, some people would roll their eyes, but other people would be like, yeah, way to go, dude. Like, everybody wants you. But if you did, people would be like, wow, you're such a slut. Mm-hmm. And all of these things contribute to why it's such a sensitive topic, because there are all of these rules, spoken or unspoken, that if you cross them, you're immediately labeled as something negative, something demeaning.
Yeah, well, and I guess as you talk about those things, it brings up a lot of like personal experiences. A big part of that is like the internalization of those messages by, I'm sure men have their own piece in this of like needing to be a stud or sexual or things. And as a woman, like I remember with my first boyfriend that like after high school starting to figure out sexuality, because I highly avoided it in high school because I didn't want the gossip and the names and the labels and things like that, and so it didn't feel like safe to explore that. And then I remember outside of high school again having differences show up in sexuality and internalizing that as me being broken, me being wrong. I remember taking different like supplements, trying all of these different things and being like, it's me. I'm broken. I'm the one that's wrong here.
Mm.
And I know I'm not the only one who's experienced that.
Oh, yeah.
So these messages like are really, really powerful and sticky
Mhm.
and pervasive in our culture.
Thank you for sharing that, and I'm really curious if I can ask to dive a little deeper because I'm a therapist.
Yeah.
As you experienced that, was there ever a space where you were able to talk about that with someone else?
I didn't bring it up in therapy. I will say that. I don't know that I had a counselor at the time. It might have been, I think that was before I ever met my first counselor. I think I brought it up with friends a little bit,
Hmm.
but I'm trying to remember how it was taken. Because I know my one friend is very like, no, like you're you're not
Mhm.
broken. You're like very on my side, or kind of what's the word for that? I don't want to say aggressive, but lovingly aggressive
Mhm.
in that way.
Protective,
Um,
maybe?
yeah, protective. And because it's not something that is like widely known, I don't think I believed
Mm.
them. Like it
Mhm.
didn't make a difference necessarily to me. It was more like, I know you're being protective. I know you love me, but I don't know that you're right.
Mhm.
I don't know that you have the knowledge to say like that I'm not.
That sounds incredibly like heavy to hold and probably incredibly shaming to hold as you look around and see other people functioning and wonder like why does my experience feel different than theirs looks?
Yeah. And it
And
didn't help that the person at the time was also manipulative,
ooh,
because of their own like life history and stuff. And so and they, I'm sure they didn't know. Like
mhm.
again, this is so pervasive in our culture that they probably were like, yeah, it's you.
Oh yeah.
Like and we're young, gosh, we were 18-ish, 18,
Mhm.
19. But yeah, it was really hard to hold and just like again take all these supplements and everything else and be like, why isn't it working? Like why isn't it the same as how they experience this?
Mm.
Now looking back, I have a lot of ideas about it. There's a lot more context and acceptance and compassion around it now, but
Hindsight is 2020. And if I could go back and talk to my 18, 19-year-old self, I would have several dozen things to say, many strongly worded because of the pain that I know I caused.
say more if you're willing.
Like I came from a perspective that was like the classic cultural stereotype of like sex is about the man and pleasure for the man. And if like I got married, if my wife isn't doing that for me, then she's wrong. She's in the wrong.
Mm.
And I'm going to push that narrative. And I look back at who I was then and it's just sad. It's like, oh, way to talk without listening.
Mm.
There is so much pain that I know that I caused my wife to experience that I wish I could go back and take. I wish I could go back and have several conversations with myself, not even aggressive ones, just ones where it's like, hey, we need to talk about this. Does this make sense?
Mm.
One of the things that she talks a lot about in this book is this idea that if you went on a hike and you have a map and then you're looking at what the terrain looks like, if the map doesn't match the terrain, which of those things are you going to question? Are you going to say the terrain is wrong or the map is wrong? Like obviously the map is wrong because the terrain is what it is. And when the map is all of these messages that we've been taught, and the terrain is our bodies, our emotional experiences, our physical experiences, we question them and we're like, well, there must be something wrong with the terrain. I need to figure that out. I need to fix it. I need to take the supplements. I need to get the treatment. I need to do the thing.
Mm.
Instead of maybe trusting that, okay, there's something here that needs to be explored.
Yeah, it's weird what we do with that sense of uncertainty, like when we don't know better. I agree. I have so many things I would say to younger me, and I do actually. Like I have a practice of part of that like inner child work, reparenting kind of thing. And so being able to bring younger me to mind and
Mm,
offer them that wisdom or just
mhm,
sit with them in that pain of like what that was like, is something I do. And yeah, I do tell them like, yeah, it wasn't you. And it's so cool to be able to have the tools more so now and the
mhm,
perspective now, um, to be able to hold that
mhm,
without that shame, and with more compassion and love. Um, and we all have those cringy things that we do when we don't know more and we
mhm.
don't know enough. I would bet, and everyone in this world has some cringy memories of their younger selves.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's part of it. Part of being human.
One of the things that I think makes this really unique, though, because yes, we absolutely all have that as part of being human. But what's unique here is how, particularly for females, you can't do it right. Like that is effectively the message that's handed out. Is that if you want too much, you're wrong in this way. If you want too little, you're wrong in that way. No matter what you do, we're going to judge you for it. There is no perfect,
Yep.
but you should try and be perfect.
Yep.
So basically, don't just be who you are.
No wonder we're anxious and depressed.
it,
Like,
it makes a lot of sense that we have so many conflicting feelings about our functioning in our bodies and all of these things when you
yeah.
actually start to like break it down.
Hmm.
And I think that's one of the reasons it's so hard for people to talk about it in therapy. Because a lot of the time when clients bring it up, they they bring it up in a very like hesitant manner.
Hmm.
And they're like, is this TMI? Or I don't know if we can talk about this here. Or I don't know. And what's interesting is that you can always tell when someone's comfortable about talking about something because, well, you can't always tell. I would argue you can generally tell because they're willing to go there. They're willing to like think about it, reflect, answer questions, actually volunteer things versus having a much more hesitant like I might say one thing about it, but then I'm going to immediately change the subject.
Mm.
And I think so much of that shows up because of this because of the way that we learn that we should feel shame about it, that
Mm.
we learn that it's not okay to bring it up.
Well, and as you mentioned earlier, like that so much of our worth or value is connected to this thing that
Mhm.
we can't do right. And I feel like in therapy, it can be so hard to bring up because this is a person of relative authority in a way. Like they have knowledge or experience, which we do. We have skills and training and things like that. And we're human.
Mhm.
So bring that. But like when the question is, am I broken? And there's a potential for that to be confirmed. Um, that's terrifying. Like
Mhm.
if this is tied to like our worth and so deeply our value, then I'd rather not know.
Mhm.
Like if that's true or not, it's easier, it's a little easier to hold having it be a thought than it is to bring it up
Mhm.
and maybe have it confirmed.
A lot of the time people do without even realizing it. They confirm that we're going to be judged.
Hmm.
Like if you think about the spectrum of things that people enjoy within sex, there are a lot of things. There are a lot of kinks, there are a lot of fetishes that you say them in a room and you'll be laughed at. Or people
Hmm.
look at you and be like, well, really? Like, wow. And that's exactly why we don't want to talk about it. Because there is so much judgment for all of these things when it's like, well, hold on. Why are we judging this? Why are we judging someone who's actually trying to be open about what their experience is? Someone who's trying to be open about something that brings them pleasure.
Well, and I think it goes back to there's this perspective and worldview of there's one right way.
Hmm.
If we had the perspective and worldview as a culture of there are many right ways, that would be very different. And I think we're trying to trend that way, and that is very uncomfortable for a lot of people. Um, and like bringing it back to in therapy, kind of one of the things I'm curious about is how because there's not training on it, like, how do therapists maybe even confirm, or I don't know, how do we show up in a way that is valuable, um, or helpful, or I don't know. I don't know. It's kind of a weird place because I know, again, we're human. We're not perfect. As much as we want to show up in these ways that are very non-judgmental and things, we also come in a wide variety of people from different, um, like, generations, different ways of thinking about things. I know. Thumbs up, everybody. This is what it is today. But yeah, so we bring all of that into therapy too, as much as we try not to, or I try not to. That's kind of a general tenet of therapy, but it does show up. So what do we do with that too?
This is part of what makes even finding a therapist tricky, and why it's always valuable to ask questions if you're looking for a therapist. Because we do all have different experiences. We all have different values. We all are even willing to learn or be trained in different things based on where we're coming from. And as an aside, like, I didn't have any requirements to study anything related to sex in my master's or my doctorate.
Wow.
But I know that that's not a universal thing. For example, in Washington State, which it's, at one point I was looking into getting licensed there. That's why I know this. I don't just walk around and study the licensure requirements in different states. But in Washington State, to get licensed as a counselor, you do actually have to take a course on sex and sexuality. And so it's like, okay, this is a thing that I think is probably going to become more universal as like, hey, we need to talk about this. We need training in this. But overwhelmingly, I would say, like, there's not a lot of training. And there's also this, like, an example of this that comes to mind very quickly is in a Facebook therapist group, which Facebook therapy groups, if you are a therapist and you're in any of those, you know what I'm talking about. If not, I'm about to let you in. Facebook therapist groups are wild, because you would think that a bunch of therapists interacting with each other would be very civil and like listening, like, how does that make you feel? It's not. People have opinions. They have strong opinions, and they're not afraid to say them as if that is the only right opinion. Like, I've seen posts of people being like, hey, I'm looking for support to work with a client on a specific issue regarding sex or sexuality. And you'll look through the comments that they get in response, and you'll see a lot that are like, yeah, absolutely, here are some resources. And then you'll see other ones that are like, oh, that's a terrible way for a person to be. Like, they should never do that. That's never going to work. That's only going to lead to unhappiness. Like, what an awful thing. I see those comments sometimes, and I'm like, yep, hopefully no one ever goes to work with that therapist, unless they just very much hold the same values and opinions. But all of that is just to illustrate that even within this realm of people who it's like, we're supposed to be trained to give people a space to talk about whatever they need to talk about. Because when we're left alone, or when we're forced to be alone in our pain, in our suffering, in what we have going on, it makes it worse. But if we have somewhere to actually talk about it, that makes a difference.
Yeah, I completely agree. Again, there's that human element to it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a beautiful thing in a lot of ways. And it can be really harmful and damaging in some ways too. That's one of the reasons I love this space, where we get to talk about that. And people like Emily Nagoski, who writes about this, to be able to say, like, with science, and more understanding and a review of history of where this stuff comes from, like, there are resources to help you explore it and confirm it, in other ways. So even if you do have an experience in therapy, or you don't feel comfortable talking about it in therapy, there are more resources. There's more information than we had before to be able to open up these topics.
The more that we're able to do that, the more we can actually unpack how do we make these topics more of an option to discuss? How do we make it something that people can bring it up and not be like, hey, is this TMI? But instead be like, hey, I want to talk about sex. It's like, yes, absolutely, let's. I want to do that too.
Mhm.
So I'm curious, what are some of the things that you do as a therapist to invite your clients to feel comfortable talking about it?
Good question. Before I answer that question, I was just thinking of the point of maybe even part of this podcast is being able to inform our listeners that if you
Mhm.
do have an experience with a counselor that you are
Ooh,
feeling
yes.
more shame and guilt about something like this, that isn't helpful. And like, don't take
Yes.
that as being you are wrong.
Mhm.
That's not the point of therapy. So
Mm.
maybe even in the way of us being able to say like this is how it what it's supposed to be,
Mhm.
maybe that could be helpful. Find another counselor or or talk to them about it and say like that's not cool, which
Mhm.
I know is hard, but yeah, just
Yeah.
wanted to bring that up as a point.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, I love that point. And
Yeah.
I will always tell people, if you're comfortable, confront them, like tell your therapist, hey, that's not okay. But also, I
Mhm.
know that that's a big step, and it's not your responsibility as the client to do that. So if it's easier just to leave and find anyone, do that instead. Anyways,
Yep.
back to you.
100% support you. Some of my values show up in there that are something I try and bring to my sessions every day, which is one, like show up. That's a
Mhm.
big part of it.
That's
I
big.
love yoga with Adrienne is
Mm.
inspiring to me. I love Adrienne, and she always says like the hardest part is showing up.
Mhm.
So I really try and internalize that and give myself some compassion. Like some days it is really hard to show up, and I still do.
Mhm.
So show up. The other piece that really comes to mind is a sense of curiosity and openness
Mm. Mhm.
that I don't know everything and that that's okay.
Mhm.
Um, so being able to even explore, like, I can tell this makes you uncomfortable. Like, where does that come from? Like, let's talk about that.
Mhm.
And that that's okay. I think it makes a lot of sense. I come from that perspective with kind of a compassion focused lens
Mhm.
of like anything that someone does in my counseling office, 99.9999, probably 100% of the time, makes a lot of sense in the
Mhm.
context that they have experienced things, that their life has progressed, the belief system, the culture. So coming from that lens, and I often say that. I'm like, I think it makes a lot of sense that you would feel that way.
Mhm.
And let's explore it further. I think those are some of the ways that I really try and open the space. And even telling them, like, I don't know exactly how to help in this area yet. I had this talk with my client because sex has been new
Mhm.
in sessions. People have started bringing it up to me more within the last couple months. And so I'll explore what is there, and then I'll say, I reached out to the Facebook group to get a little bit more resources on how to explore this. These are some of the things I found, like this book, Come As You Are. A couple other books were shared too. I'm listening to this now so that we can explore this further. If you want to listen to it too, I would love to kind of co listen and then talk about it.
Mhm.
So, being a lifelong learner, I think, is something that yeah, that helps me take myself off a pedestal for my clients. That it's like we don't have to know everything. Even as a professional, you cannot know, um,
Mhm.
and you can go out and learn, and that's what matters more
Mm.
than just knowing all of it.
I love that approach that you brought up that says, like, if there's discomfort, let's explore the discomfort.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we feel shame, we build walls.
Mm-hmm.
And if we try and explore something and there's a wall around it and we just like peek through this hole, it's like, yeah, we can see some of what's in there, but we got to figure out what the walls are and why they're necessary. Because if we can bring down the walls, there's so much more light to actually explore what's beneath it, which I think is huge.
Mm-hmm.
But when I think about how I try and invite people to talk about it, I will sometimes just bring it up, be like, hey, sex is one of the things that we can talk about, not TMI here. And the other thing that I always try and do, like, yes, we don't need to know everything. Unless this is your niche, this is your focus, you are a certified sex therapist who did all of the training that's involved with becoming that. you're probably only going to know like a handful. But one of the things I always try and do is I try and know my handful, so that if somebody brings up something related to a kink or a fetish or polyamory or really anything, I want to know enough to make it so I can talk about it and they can be like, oh, I'm not sharing something that you've never ever heard before. Because I want people to know it's like, hey, this is a space for this. You're not the first person to bring this up.
Mm.
Because I think that can be very normalizing.
Mm.
But it also, I have found, like, when someone starts talking about something and I start using some of the lingo, I've noticed a shift in how people talk about it, because they're like, oh, like this isn't your first rodeo. Nice. And so that's another one of those little things that I specifically try and do outside of just the general, no matter what you bring up, we can talk about it here. Like nothing is too big, nothing is too scary, nothing is too taboo. And there should be nothing that gets brought up here that results in me shaming you for the fact that you brought it up.
So saying like this, you're not the first person to bring it up. My mind, I don't know if this is just like devil's advocate. It's like, but someone had to be the first person to bring it up. Like, or how else would you have started that exploration? Like, how do you do that? How do you have the little bits enough to start?
A lot of it is through exploring myself, through reading books, through having conversations, through being like, I am generally a curious person. If I see something and I'm like, oh, what is that? I'm going to Google it. I'm going to be like, I want to learn more. Is there, like, where do I find more information about this? And essentially, like, if somebody ever comes to me to work with something specific and I know on the front end, I'm going to spend time learning about it beforehand, because I want to be able to have conversations where I don't need to be the expert that knows all the answers, but I want them to trust that I'm not blind. With sex specifically, like I've read books like Come As You Are, but I've also read books like Polysecure that are more about like a poly lifestyle, or really looking into anything that goes beyond just the like one version of a sexual, what's even the word I'm looking for? I guess one version of there's one way that sex should be done and that's it. Because it's not really how reality works.
And as I think about it, as you talk about it like that, having these resources means you're not the first person to like feel this way or bring it up. Yeah. So yeah, the validation and normalizing of that too, of like, yeah, this is something that people have experienced and let's explore.
I love that you pulled that out of my answer, because I meant to say that and it didn't make it out. I got too excited. But there are probably going to be a lot of different perspectives on this. This is just mine. I think that the experience of showing up in therapy and having your therapist be like, wow, I've never heard that before. Like, I've had clients come and talk to me and say they've had that experience and talk about how negative it was for them. And so my general rule of thumb is that I never, like, if somebody comes in, I never say, wow, that's crazy, you're the first person about anything that is like this. Like, maybe if they have some obscure career. I know that I've worked with one or two people who have careers where it's like, wow, I've never heard of that job before. But like, in terms of human functioning, no, I never say it, because I don't want them to feel alienated by it. And I know that they are not the only one, and I know that I can get on Google and find anything and demonstrate you're not the only one.
Yeah, I'm like, what's the point of saying that? Like, as a counselor, like, what's the function of being like, huh, I haven't heard of that before? Like, because I'll be honest with people if they're like, have you heard of that or something? And I'll be like, I actually maybe haven't, with my limited worldview, haven't heard of that. But I'm curious and I'm happy to look into it or something. But I'm not like outright just going to be like, wow, that's crazy. Like, what are you doing over there? Like, but that's part of my, like, my values, like, of being authentic and honest. I'm okay to say, like, I know, again, it's valid. You're not the first person to experience that, or feel that way, or think that way, or like that thing. And I am limited in my worldview. That's that's also true. But I don't need to say that unless it's helpful in some way. Which again, kind of like we've talked about before on the podcast, is like part of the training of counseling is like what we're saying is generally supposed to have a function that is beneficial for the client. So really thinking about what we're saying and why we're saying it.
In that approach that is very intentional about thinking about what we're saying. That's part of being a therapist is the I'm thinking about the dominoes that I'm about to knock over with the words that I put out. And sometimes I think 5 dominoes down, sometimes 10, and sometimes 1. And occasionally when it's 1, it's like, can we back up for a second?
Yeah.
Which, speaking of, I feel like I should add a disclaimer. I don't tell clients I'm an expert on things. If someone brings something up and I'm not super familiar, I do say that. Feel like I should throw that out there because I know we're putting this on the internet, and people on the internet will be like, wow, you're misrepresenting yourself. No, I don't do that. When somebody brings something up and I don't know a lot, I will say that. I'll be like, I don't have a ton of experience here, but I know a little bit. And yeah, felt like that was important to clarify just so I don't get totally come for by anybody who listened this far into our podcast.
Yeah. So part of me is thinking about, again, we've talked a lot about culture, and I love the metaphor of the garden that Emily Nagoski brings up in Come As You Are. I wonder if that would be helpful to explore.
Oh, yeah.
Here. Do you want to explain it?
The idea of the garden metaphor is that each of us is a garden. And the things that we believe about ourselves, our values, all of the things that we've learned through life are little plants in our garden. And you're born as this beautiful little child who everybody celebrates and rejoices over, and it's like, wow, every little part of your body is amazing. And then over the course of your life, different things are planted in your garden. Some of them are roses, some of them are other flowers, some of them are some are good, and then some are things like thistles where it's like, I don't really want that in my garden. But when you're growing up, you don't get to choose what's planted. Things get planted by the people in your life, by your parents, by others that you interact with. And then the older you get, the more you get to choose, how do I want to actually tend the garden? And what's challenging is so often we end up with things planted in our gardens that shame us. We end up with things planted in our gardens that cause us to not even want to go in the garden, to not want to look in the mirror, to not want to actually engage with ourselves. And what's beautiful about this metaphor, and one of the reasons I also love it, is that when you think about a garden exists to be tended. Like a garden exists to be cared for, and there's nothing in a garden that has to be permanently there in the way that it is right now. And yes, if you have a garden with a bunch of thistles in it, it's going to be hard to get them out because just like in reality, a thistle is pokey. So you go to grab it, you're going to get poked. It's going to be uncomfortable. Like that's the process of therapy. Therapy is uncomfortable because we're working through what are some of these values, what are some of these attitudes towards self that you've held that haven't served you, that have hurt you, that have shamed you. And how do we explore those with compassion and curiosity and soften the soil so that we can remove them and you can plant what you want to be there.
I love the metaphor. We can go so deep with it in so many different ways. But I'm like, therapy could be the gloves that you use to pull the thistle out so you're not just getting poked. And, we can also just not water it. That's an option too. We can just let it die, and whatever nutrients are in that plant can go back to the soil, and then we can plant something new in its place and water that. And I think the cool thing, one of the things I love about us being able to talk about this, and the whole point of making space for these kinds of things, is to say, you don't have to keep all of the things that other people put in your garden. There is a choice. I think most people don't know that there's a choice until they do, and then there's a lot of space to explore that and move around. So that's a big piece of it too, is just knowing there's a choice, that you can choose not to believe some of these things or to believe something different that feels more right to you, more aligned with your values, or more loving or kind or compassionate or whatever it is that you care about.
You saying that made me think about this. As humans, there are two eyes things that we do. We normalize and we generalize. So my experience is normal. Everyone else must function like this. Everyone else must feel this way. Everyone else must think this way. And that's also where the generalization piece comes in, is that everyone else does it this way. And we so naturally land there that we don't question it. We don't say, maybe I could explore this. Maybe it doesn't have to be this way. Maybe this doesn't have to be a painful experience. Maybe I don't have to hold all of the shame directed at myself about this part of me.
Mm-hmm.
And talking about it can be an incredibly valuable part of working through it. And it's hard. Like it's uncomfortable to bring these things up when you haven't talked about it much. It's kind of like when I think back over times that I've been vulnerable about these things, I can hold space in my body where I'm like, oh yeah, my heart rate is up. I'm starting to sweat. I can feel the words are all right there and they want to come out, but there's that wall that I'm like, the shame of holding that. What will you think about me if I tell you this?
Mm-hmm.
And that, again, shameless plug for therapy. That's the beauty that so many therapists have to offer, is that they can be a space where you can say that and they won't respond terribly. And I know that there are terrible therapists out there who have. But in general, I would argue most of us will not. Most of us will hear that and be like, yes, I can hold the space for that with you. You don't have to do it alone. And that's the beauty of this, is that we can do that. We can uncover those things together, even when it's uncomfortable, even when you haven't talked about it before.
Even when it's about sex.
Even when it's about sex. Because again, there is no such thing as TMI. Give me all of the information. I want to know all of it. Yeah.
As much as is useful.
Yes.
Which could be all of it. Yeah.
I'm curious, what are some of the things that you would, like, if there was somebody who's sitting there listening to this,
Mm-hmm.
and they're like, oh, I want to talk about it, but I don't know how. How do you start?
The image my brain comes up with is like sitting next to someone on a couch or something, and kind of like people do it. They're like, so the weather, like, so sex is what the image came to mind. But yeah, kind of in that way of like asking, and I love, I guess one of the reasons I think we continue to plug therapy is because it generally is more of that open space. Because a lot of times when you do bring up these topics with people who have those worldviews and haven't wanted to change them or look at them, or, I mean, they work for those people enough, then bringing it up isn't necessarily helpful, useful, or safe. And so I think, again, that's why we kind of plug therapy a lot of the times, because it is more of an open space. So I would say with someone you trust, with someone that feels safe or open to you, that could be a friend, family member, or a therapist, or anywhere in that, just maybe asking the first question or opening it up, be like, sex. It's part of the human experience. What I wonder, even being curious about it, like, why is this so hard to talk about? Like, why is it so uncomfortable?
I think you're on the right track. Because if you can acknowledge that this is a topic that's probably not going to be like completely comfortable, unless you've talked about it a ton. Like Emily Nagoski, she talks about this a lot, where she's like, I have people come up to me everywhere that I am and ask these questions. And every time they start the same way, where they're like, hey, like, I don't know if I can talk about this. Maybe you've never heard it. Like, there's always that disclaimer on the front end that just, it acknowledges the shame that we feel about it. And so know that it's not going to be a comfortable thing to talk about if you've never talked about it before and you're from our culture where it is, like, there's a lot of different messages around it. But you can start somewhere. Start small. Like, talk about a little piece of it, or maybe even just like feel it out. Just be like, hey, can can we talk about this, or bring up a piece of it and be like, I had this experience the other day, or like just something little that will allow you to gauge, is this a safe place to talk about this?
Mm-hmm.
Allow yourself to be okay with it being uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
Allow yourself to actually put it out there.
So I guess all of this to say, like, start to be open about it, even if it's just thinking about it. Maybe it's not talking about it with someone at first. Maybe it's listening to this audiobook, or thinking about what it's like for you, listening to this podcast, even to start just opening some space within yourself. And then, maybe these are steps down that journey, down that path.
One of the things I know that we want to talk about here is we want to get even further in. We're going to, I think, do this in the next episode. We want to get even further into some of the specific things that create shame. Mm-hmm. Whether it's something like arousal nonconcordance, or something around a specific, like, widely held cultural belief or scientific view that says, like, hey, this is how it should be, and if you don't fit this way, then there's something wrong with you. Like, we want to get into all of those topics and talk about not just how they've created pain and suffering and shame, but also talk about more specific little things that you can do to improve that. To work to heal those hurts, to work to uncover some of the shame and actually work through it. But that won't be in this conversation. That'll be in the next one. Not today. And on that note, I'm curious, do you have anything you want to add, Makayla, before we wrap this up?
I don't know if someone else has said this quote before, but it came to mind for me as I was working last year. I'm building my business. It's a new thing. Trying to go through all of the emotions that is. But what came to mind is the quote, like, you're not feeling this way because you're doing it wrong. You're feeling this way because you're doing it.
Ooh, that's good.
Thank you. I love it. And I say it to myself, and I've said it to my clients too. But again, that's part of it. Like, it's uncomfortable. You're doing it. Like, good job. It's not because it's wrong. So we don't need to equate those two things. Like, let's equate it with, again, maybe that courage, the perseverance, whatever it is that trying, even just trying. I want to, I guess, invite you to take that perspective that, if it's uncomfortable, it doesn't mean you're doing it wrong.
I love to applaud people who are out there doing it. Like, it's so, and this is not even just related to sex. There's so many things that we see people doing that we judge. We judge them for doing it because they're not good at it. And we shouldn't. Like, when you see me out there trying to run, getting passed by someone who looks like they're walking, I'm still out there running. So what that they're running faster? I'm still out there. And like that, like, we need to try and shift so much of how we interact with others to a more positive, like, encouraging, compassionate, curious, cheerful, like, whatever words we want to put with it. It's so much more valuable to exude that than it is to exude, like, wow, you suck at this. You shouldn't even be out here.
And it's more fun too. It's more enjoyable. Brief story that relates exactly to this, but like, I had a client the other day, an adolescent, and I invited them to, like, celebrate mistakes. And even for my mind, that's like, what? Because I grew up in the culture and the world, and with the parents and everything I did that, like, more so perfectionism or things that way. But since I've invited them to do that, and I've done it myself in certain ways, I've tried to do it more intentionally. And again, with that same thing of, like, when I notice a mistake, can I be like, nice, I'm trying. Like, that's the message I want to take from it, is not that I'm not perfect, I'm not good at it yet. Like, I'm not going to get there if I don't try. So the message, like, I'm taking from it is I'm trying. And that's where I'm, cheering myself on about it. And it's way more fun.
Oh, yeah. And mistakes are such a valuable part of growing and learning. And I feel like this conversation has turned in the direction that it very much fits who both of us are, as just generally encouraging and like, yes, let's do this type people. And we've totally left what we started with. But that's okay. talk
It
about
all
sex.
it all
It's helpful.
meshes together.
It does. And
So.
if you have made it this far, thank you for listening. We would love to hear from you in the comments. Feel free to ask us any questions, maybe bring up topics that you want us to talk about in the future. I'm pretty dying. I'm pretty sure that we could probably come up with infinite things to talk about, but we also want to know, what do you want to hear about from the perspective of two therapists who are exploring making space for parts of the human experience? And on that note, have a lovely whatever time of day it is, wherever you are, whenever it is.
Yes. Thank you.